Be me anon, 27. Work as an electrician. Been doing it since I was about 19. Apprenticed under a guy who didn't waste words, just showed you how to do things and expected you to remember. Picked up that way of being from him, I think. He had this philosophy where if you see something that needs doing, you do it. You don't wait to be asked. You don't stand around debating it. You just handle it and move on. I absorbed that completely. If something's broken, you figure out what's wrong and you fix it. If something needs to be built, you build it. If someone needs help, you help them without making a speech about it first. That's just how I was raised, too. My dad was the same kind of person. Not cold or anything, just practical. The kind of guy who shows up when you need him and doesn't require a ceremony around it. I always respected that about him, and I think I ended up the same way. Not everyone appreciates that style. I know that. Some people want more talking, more processing, more discussion of the feelings involved in a situation. I can do that. It just doesn't come naturally to me. Naturally, I move toward action. Anyway, met Zara at a mutual friend's get-together. One of those evenings where you know maybe half the people, and you end up standing near the drinks, trying to look like you're doing something. She came over and started talking to me, which I appreciated because I'm not great at initiating with strangers. She was confident, had a lot of opinions, seemed like she'd actually thought about things. I liked that. I'm not great at small talk, so I tend to gravitate toward people who have something to say. She had a psychology degree, mentioned it in the first 15 minutes of meeting her. Worked at a coffee shop, framed it as temporary while she figured out her next move. Seemed like she had plans, just hadn't landed on the specific one yet. We exchanged numbers, started talking over the next few days, started hanging out properly a week or two after that. A few months later, it was official. I was 26 at this point. She was 25. First stretch of the relationship was genuinely fine. I was doing what I always do. I showed up. I fixed things. I handled stuff when it needed handling. She had a slow coolant leak in her car that had been going on for a while before she mentioned it. I took a look over a weekend, found the issue, sorted it. Her laptop kept crashing at inconvenient moments. She'd been living with it for weeks. I looked at it one evening. Turned out to be a software issue. Fixed it in about an hour. Her landlord was one of those people who just stops responding the moment he's cashed the rent. Ignores texts, lets voicemails stack up, disappears for weeks at a time. I called him directly, introduced myself, made it clear without being unpleasant that I wasn't someone he could run his usual routine on. The thing he was supposed to fix got handled within a few days. She was happy, seemed genuinely grateful, and I felt like we had a good dynamic going. I was the person who sorted practical things, and she managed the emotional side of things, and together it kind of worked. Or, at least, I thought so. What I didn't clock at the time was that her appreciation had a short shelf life. Like the first handful of times I did something practical and useful, she'd thank me properly, seemed pleased. But after a while, the thank yous got shorter and less frequent. And then they basically stopped. I'd finish working on something that had taken actual time and thought, and she'd just glance up from her phone and nod. Or, not even that, just continue whatever she was doing without acknowledging it. I told myself it was comfort, that when you're properly comfortable with someone you stop being formal about things. Which is true to some extent, but there's a difference between comfortable and just not registering that someone did something for you. She'd crossed that line without me noticing when it happened. I didn't bring it up, partly because I couldn't work out how to say it without sounding petty, partly because I genuinely wasn't sure if I was being oversensitive. So I kept doing what I was doing, and she kept not noticing. A few months in is when the rules started. Not all at once, they arrived gradually. She'd read something online or hear something from her friend, and suddenly there was a new approach we were adopting. First one was about interrupting. She said I cut her off when she was making a point, and she needed that to stop. Fair enough. I can pay more attention to that. Started making a conscious effort. Next one was something about making sure to ask about her day before talking about my own. Also manageable, small adjustment. Then one about not using certain phrases during disagreements, because those phrases apparently shut down productive communication. I tried to remember which ones and avoid them. On their own, each rule was pretty reasonable. The issue was, they kept coming. Every few weeks there was something new. And it was never framed as a conversation we were having together as a couple. It was always presented as a thing she'd figured out that we were now going to implement. She'd sit down, phone sometimes in hand, slightly formal in manner, and explain the new approach. I'd nod and incorporate it. I'm a practical person. I take instructions and I follow them. But after several months of this, it started to feel less like a relationship and more like a compliance exercise. Like I was a process that needed continuous optimization rather than a person she was building something with. I mentioned this once, gently. Said something like, maybe we could talk about these adjustments together before implementing them, rather than it always coming from one direction. She said I was being resistant to personal growth. I dropped it, didn't raise it again. The psychology vocabulary was something that ground on me more and more as time went on. She had this habit of translating everything I did into clinical terms from whatever she'd studied or been reading. If I needed space after getting home from a long day, she'd call it avoidance. If I didn't immediately want to process something, I was being emotionally unavailable. If I pushed back on something she'd said, I was being defensive. If I went quiet during a disagreement, I was shutting down. If I was direct about something, I was being aggressive. If I took time to think before responding, I was stonewalling. Every way of existing had a label, and every label was something I needed to work on. I want to be fair here. I'm sure there were genuine moments where I was actually being defensive in an unhelpful way, or actually pulling away when I should have been present. I'm not perfect, and I know that. But when every single thing you do gets filtered through a diagnostic framework, when there's no neutral behavior, when any way of responding is evidence of something wrong with you, it stops feeling like communication. It feels like a case being built. And I noticed pretty early on that she never applied this framework to herself. When she got upset and went cold, that was just her needing space. When she contradicted herself, that was just her perspective evolving. When she said something sharp and I reacted, she'd focus on my reaction rather than the thing that prompted it. Different rules applying to different people in the same relationship. I filed that observation away and kept my mouth shut about it. I'd tried to raise something once and been told I was resistant to growth. I didn't want to go through that again. So I kept adapting, kept meeting new expectations as they arrived, and I think that just made her comfortable setting more of them. The rule that actually changed the trajectory of things came later. We'd had dinner. It was a fairly normal evening. She'd been on her phone and I'd been reading. She put her phone down and said she'd been thinking about communication patterns. Said that whenever she talked about a problem or something that was frustrating her, my first instinct was always to jump in and try to fix it. Said she understood I meant well, but it was actually making her feel unheard. Explained that when someone tries to immediately fix your problem, it sends a message that they don't trust you to handle it yourself, that they're not actually present with you, just trying to make the discomfort stop. Said it was a toxic male fix-it mentality. That phrase exactly. I remember it clearly. Said she didn't need a mechanic, she needed a partner who could just be present without trying to change anything. Said from now on, when she was venting or working through something, I wasn't to offer solutions. Just listen. Just validate her feelings. Just be there. I sat with that for a few seconds. Thought about the coolant leak, the laptop, the landlord, all the weekends and evenings I'd spent fixing things. Thought about how that had never felt like a lack of presence to me. It had felt like the opposite. But she had this look that made it clear the decision had already been made, and any disagreement was going to be interpreted as confirming her point. So I said, okay, and I genuinely tried to follow it. The first few weeks were uncomfortable. Someone tells me about a problem, and my brain immediately starts working on what can be done about it. Holding that back is effortful in a way that doesn't go away just because you're aware of it. She'd come home frustrated about something at work, a difficult shift, or a coworker who was causing problems, and I'd be sitting there saying things like, "That sounds really frustrating," and "I can hear how much that got to you," while internally I was composing a list of practical options. Didn't voice any of them. She seemed to appreciate it. Told her friend, apparently, that I was finally listening properly. Heard that secondhand through something she mentioned and found it odd. I hadn't changed how much I cared. I just suppressed the part of how I showed it. But okay, if that counted as growth, then fine. What started bothering me pretty quickly was that the rules seemed to only exist for me. When I had a rough week at work and mentioned it, she'd immediately start giving advice. Told me I should speak to my supervisor about the situation. Told me I should consider whether this job was still the right fit. Told me to set clearer expectations with the people on site. None of which I'd asked for. The first time I let it go. Told myself maybe she just hadn't thought through the symmetry of it. The second time I let it go. By the fourth or fifth time, I was noting it with something more behind it. But I said nothing because I'd already figured out how that conversation would end. She'd explain why her advice-giving was categorically different from my fix-it mentality. There'd be a distinction I'd failed to understand. The conversation would end with me having something new to work on. So I stayed quiet and just noticed. The other thing that was changing was harder to pin down. A general cooling in how she engaged with me day to day. Small things, the kind you can dismiss individually. The warmth in small moments started disappearing. The way she'd greet me when I came home, the way she'd respond when I said something funny, small physical things like sitting close on the couch or a hand on my arm. These things became less frequent, and then pretty rare. I'd come home from a long job, tired, and she'd be on her laptop, and we'd just occupy the same flat without really intersecting. I kept telling myself it was a rough patch, that relationships go through these periods, that it would shift back. I kept waiting. Her car started having problems again. Different issue from the one I'd sorted before. Engine was running rough, losing power at certain points. She brought it up at dinner, and the way she mentioned it was a specific tone I'd heard many times. The tone of someone expecting a particular response. The old one, where I'd immediately say I'd take a look over the weekend. I set my fork down, looked at her, told her that sounded really stressful, and asked how she was feeling about having to deal with it. She looked at me with an expression I hadn't quite seen before. Asked what I meant. I said she'd asked me not to offer solutions when she brought up problems, so I was validating her feelings about the situation. She laughed, just slightly, the uncomfortable kind, like she was waiting for me to say I was joking. I wasn't joking. I was completely serious. She moved past it and said she was sure it would work itself out and change the subject. I didn't mention the car again. She waited several days, and I think expected me to just go look at it anyway, like the rule was theoretical, but the old behavior would continue regardless. I didn't. I want to be honest about what I was doing at this point. It wasn't entirely pure. There was definitely some element of testing something, of seeing what actually happened when I stopped running on autopilot. But I also genuinely felt like the rule she'd made was a real thing she'd said, and I had every right to follow it. She'd framed it as important. The car sat there for about 5 days before she called a garage and had it taken in. Paid for the repair herself. Came home that evening clearly not pleased about it. I asked if it was sorted, and she said yes, in the tone that means yes. But there's something attached to that yes that I want you to notice. I said glad it's sorted and left it there. The landlord situation came around again not long after. Something needed fixing in the bathroom. The landlord was doing his usual act of being completely unreachable. She'd been trying to get hold of him for over a week. In the past, I'd have just called him directly. He'd learned from previous experience that if I was calling, it wasn't going away. She knew this was an available option. Instead, I sat next to her while she drafted yet another text and said something like, "He genuinely doesn't respect your time. That's really frustrating to deal with." She turned and looked at me. The look was different this time. More pointed, like she was starting to understand something but hadn't named it yet. I held the same expression, completely sincere. This is what being present looked like, I thought. Listening without trying to fix. Validating without solving. The bathroom situation went on for nearly 2 weeks. I watched her stress about it, tried different approaches to reaching him, get increasingly fed up. She asked at one point if I could maybe call him. I said I thought it was important for her to feel capable of handling her own relationship with her landlord, and that I didn't want to undermine that by stepping in. She stared at me for a long moment before going into the other room. The landlord eventually responded, sent someone over. The thing got fixed. She never addressed it directly with me, but I could feel the temperature between us continuing to drop. Her friend was getting regular updates, I gathered, because I'd sometimes hear one side of those calls and the tone wasn't flattering toward me. She brought it up one evening, had clearly been preparing how to have the conversation. Sat across from me and said I'd been passive-aggressive, and that I was using her own framework as a weapon against her. I said I'd been following the communication approach she'd asked for. She said that wasn't what she'd meant. I asked her to explain what she had meant so I could actually do it correctly. She said I knew exactly what she'd meant, and I was being deliberately difficult. I said genuinely, without any edge, that I wasn't clear on the distinction between what she'd asked for and what I'd been doing, and I wanted to understand it. She said that response was exactly the problem, that I was so focused on being technically correct that I was missing the entire point. I thought about pointing out that she'd asked me to stop fixing things and focus on feelings, and now she was criticizing me for not making a logical distinction between types of listening. I didn't say that. I said I was sorry things had felt off and that I was trying. She said it didn't feel like I was trying. I went to the kitchen, made tea, came back with 2 cups, handed her one. She took it without saying anything. We watched something on TV for a couple of hours without talking much. She fell asleep on the couch. I put a blanket over her and went to bed. Lay there thinking about the blanket thing. How I'd just done it automatically without thinking, because it was what the moment needed. And it would never register. She'd wake up, know she had a blanket, that would be the end of it. Couldn't work out why that bothered me more than some of the bigger things, but it did. A week or so after that, she asked me to help with some paperwork. Tax stuff, not complicated if you've dealt with it before, but tedious if you haven't. I looked at her and asked, without any sarcasm in my voice, whether she wanted help actually sorting it out, or whether she needed to talk through how she felt about having to deal with it. She said I was being ridiculous. I told her I was asking a legitimate question because I wanted to be useful in the way she actually needed. She said I was impossible to talk to and went into the other room. I sat at the table looking at the paperwork she'd left there. I could have done it in 20 minutes. I knew exactly what needed doing. But I'd reached a point where doing something without being explicitly asked was equally likely to result in annoyance as gratitude, and I was tired of rolling that dice. So I left the paperwork where it was and went and read in the bedroom. Heard her on the phone to her friend about an hour later, laughing at something. The paperwork got sorted eventually. I assumed the friend helped. The thank yous had stopped at some point, and I couldn't pinpoint when exactly. She didn't ask about my days anymore either. I'd come in from work, and she'd be mid-laptop or mid-show, and we'd just coexist in the same space without really connecting. Not every evening. There were still moments that were okay, but the okay moments were becoming the exception. One evening, when she was out, I fixed the bathroom tap. There was a drip that had come back. Either something had shifted, or the repair hadn't been done properly. I had the time. I had the tools. I just sorted it. Didn't mention it when she came home. Not as a statement, just didn't seem worth announcing. She came in, went to the kitchen, walked past the bathroom multiple times through the evening. Nothing. I stood in the hallway at one point and looked at the closed bathroom door. Thought about the car, the laptop, the landlord calls, the furniture I'd assembled when she moved into this place, the tap I'd just done. Thought about how none of it had accumulated into anything lasting. Not warmth, not appreciation, not a sense that it meant something. Just background infrastructure that was expected to be there. Something settled in me standing there. Not anger. More like that feeling when you've been waiting for a bus and you check the board, and the thing says no further service tonight. I'd been waiting for the relationship to return to something that felt mutual, that felt like we were actually on the same side. Standing in the hallway, I was pretty clear that it wasn't coming back. Not because one big thing had happened, just because we drifted into somewhere neither of us were actually okay. I didn't do anything with that thought right then. Made dinner, we ate, she went to bed, I stayed up on my own for a bit. Watched something on my phone and thought about nothing in particular. The next few days, she made some effort. Brought me coffee one morning out of nowhere, first time in months. Asked about a job I'd been on that had been giving me trouble. I said thanks, appreciated the gesture, told her about the job. She listened, asked a follow-up question. I tried to take it at face value, tried to let it reset something, but I could feel it not quite taking, like trying to relight something that had already gone out. I hated feeling that way. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't looking for reasons to leave. I would have been perfectly happy to be wrong about everything I'd been feeling, but you can't unnotice things once they've settled in you. Things continued for a couple more weeks. Minor friction everywhere. Nothing dramatic, just an ongoing low level of things being off. She'd make a comment, and I'd feel it differently than I would have a year ago. I'd come home tired and register the absence of things that used to be there. Small stuff, but it adds up. There was also an incident with her friend that I probably should mention. They'd had some kind of falling out, not a major one, just one of those friendship friction things where someone says something that lands wrong. She was upset about it when she came home, more upset than the situation seemed to warrant from the outside. Sat on the couch and went through the whole thing in detail. I sat across from her and listened, said things like, "That sounds really hurtful," and "I can see why that got under your skin," at the appropriate moments. She talked for a while, went in circles a bit, which is normal when you're processing something. I stayed present. I nodded. I didn't offer a single suggestion for how to handle it. Not one. After maybe 40 minutes, she seemed to feel better, said it helped to talk through it. I said I was glad. She went to make tea, came back, seemed lighter. I thought this was what she'd been asking for, and that maybe I'd finally understood how to do it right. 2 days later, the friend thing came up again, and this time I could tell she wasn't just venting, she genuinely wanted it to resolve. Without thinking, I said something like, "It might be worth just texting her directly and saying what you actually meant, rather than letting it sit." She looked at me, said I was doing the thing again. I said I thought she wanted help this time, not just validation. She said I always assumed I knew what she needed, instead of asking. I said, "Okay, what do you need right now?" She said she needed me to stop making everything about what I thought was the right move. I said, "Okay, I'm sorry. What would be helpful?" She said she needed me to just be there without having an agenda. I said okay and sat there. She stared at me for a moment and then said my stillness was passive-aggressive. I gave up on that conversation, went to the kitchen, and stood there for a minute, looking out the window. There was genuinely no way to respond that wasn't wrong. That was becoming a pattern I couldn't solve my way out of. The friend situation resolved on its own within a week. They texted, sorted it out. Zara mentioned it like it was nothing, moved on. I thought about the 40 minutes I'd spent listening carefully 2 weeks before. Didn't say anything. The work situation also got more tense during this stretch. I'd been on a job that was genuinely difficult, commercial building. The original wiring had been done badly, and fixing it without disrupting the whole system was one of those problems that followed me home. I'd mention it sometimes, not looking for anything specific, just talking about my day the way people do. She'd give advice, told me I needed to document everything before touching it so I had protection if something went wrong. Told me I should push back on the timeline because it sounded unrealistic. Told me to think about whether this kind of stress was worth what I was being paid. I didn't say anything about the fact that this was exactly what she'd banned me from doing. I didn't even think it was malicious on her part. I just think she genuinely never noticed that the rule only traveled in one direction, which was almost more frustrating than if she'd been doing it on purpose. At one point, I tried an experiment. She was talking about something at work, a customer who'd been rude about the way her coffee was made. I waited for her to finish, and then said something like, "Have you thought about speaking to your manager about the way the customer complaint process works?" She paused, gave me the look. I said I was just wondering if there was a practical step that might help. She said I was doing the fix-it thing. I said I knew, and that I'd noticed she did it to me regularly when I mentioned work stuff, and I was just wondering how we thought about that. She said that was completely different. I asked how. She said because she wasn't trying to dismiss my feelings, she was just trying to help. I said that was also what I was trying to do. She said she didn't want to get into a debate about it. I said okay. She said I had a habit of turning everything into an argument. I said I thought I'd asked a pretty calm question. She said that tone was itself a form of passive aggression. I went to bed that night genuinely tired in a way that wasn't about the hours I'd worked. There was also the evening she came home with a new article she wanted me to read. Printed it out, which I thought was a bit unusual. Something about emotional labor in relationships and how it typically falls on women. Left it on the kitchen table and asked if I could have a look at it. I read it. It wasn't a bad article, actually. Made some reasonable points. There were parts that felt like they were describing something completely different from the reality I was living in, but I could see the general argument. She asked what I thought. I said I thought it raised some valid points about communication and division of emotional work. She seemed to be waiting for more. I asked if there was something specific in it she wanted to discuss. She said she felt like she was doing most of the emotional work in our relationship. I sat with that. Wanted to point out that I was the one adapting to a new rule every month and following all of them. Wanted to point out that I'd spent the last several months doing what felt like active emotional labor just to avoid saying the wrong thing in any given conversation. Wanted to point out that I'd been listening without fixing, validating without advising, adjusting every instinct I had to match what she needed, and that none of that had seemed to register as effort. I said none of that. Told her I heard that she'd been feeling that way, and asked what she thought would help. She said she didn't know, that she needed me to figure it out myself. I said I wanted to understand better, so I could actually act on it. She said that was the problem. I always needed things spelled out. I couldn't just feel what was needed. I said I was an electrician. I work with things I can see and measure. Feeling what's needed isn't a skill I have naturally, but I'll work on it. She said that was very telling. I went to make dinner. We ate without talking about it further. The article sat on the table for a few days before I put it in the recycling. She didn't say anything about that either. The final thing happened when her paycheck situation came up. I don't know the exact details of it. Something with how the coffee shop handled payments that month, a delay or error in the system. She came home clearly stressed, sat down across from me, explained that she was going to be short for rent. The expression on her face while she said it was one I recognized. The expression of someone who expects the other person to immediately step in and sort it out. I'd seen that expression many times over the past year. I watched her finish explaining and sat with it for a moment. Then told her it sounded really stressful and that I was there if she needed to talk through it. The silence after that was a specific kind. She looked at me and I watched something shift in her face. Started with what I'd describe as controlled frustration and moved somewhere louder fairly quickly. Said I was useless. Said a normal person would just help instead of sitting there being useless. Said she didn't understand what I was even there for if I wasn't going to do anything. Said I was exactly what was wrong with how men approached relationships. She kept going for a bit, listing things out. I let her finish, stood up slowly, kept my voice level. Told her that what she'd just described, stepping in and sorting things without being asked, was exactly what I'd done for the entire first stretch of our relationship. And it was also exactly what she'd sat me down and told me was a toxic pattern she needed me to stop. Told her she didn't get to make a rule prohibiting something and then be angry when I followed it. She didn't engage with that. Pivoted immediately, the way she always did when the actual argument wasn't going her way. Said I'd never really understood her. Said I was emotionally closed off. Said everything that had happened over the past months proved her point about toxic male behavior. Said I was using her own words as weapons against her. Said she'd tried so hard to help me grow, and I'd responded by sabotaging everything. I listened to all of it. Thought about the tap she'd walked past. Thought about the Saturday I'd spent on her car before any rule existed. Thought about standing in the hallway knowing. Didn't say any of that. Went to the bedroom and got my bag down from the wardrobe. She followed and stood in the doorway. Her posture said she thought this was a move, that I was performing leaving to make her apologize and reset things. I packed what I actually needed. Clothes, some documents, things I'd need short term. Left everything else because I'd deal with it separately later. She said my name once while I was packing. Uncertain, like she wasn't sure what she wanted me to do with that. I zipped the bag, picked it up, looked at her in the doorway, told her good luck with the car. She didn't say anything. Walked past her to the front door. Opened it, closed it behind me, went down to the street, got in my truck, sat there with the engine off for a minute, not falling apart, not emotional in the way you'd maybe expect, more like the specific quiet after a decision has been made and there's nothing left to decide. Started the engine and drove to a mate's place. He opened the door, saw the bag, didn't ask a lot of questions, handed me a beer and put something on TV. That was exactly the right response. Slept on his couch that night and slept better than I had in weeks. Next morning, there were texts from Zara. First one said I was being dramatic. Second one said we needed to talk. I read them both, made tea, didn't reply to either. More came over the following days, the tone shifting around. Some were angry, some were sad. One was a long one that reconstructed everything that had happened in a way that had her as the reasonable party throughout. I read them all. Didn't reply to any of them. Stayed at my mate's while I sorted out the next move. Found a flat, not far from work, small but fine. Went back to collect my things when I knew she'd be at the coffee shop. Took what was mine. Left everything else exactly where it was. Left her key on the kitchen counter. Did a last walkthrough before leaving. Stopped at the bathroom. Tap wasn't dripping. Still not dripping. The one I'd fixed the evening she'd come home and walked straight past to the kitchen. She'd never mentioned it in any of the texts. Not in the angry ones, not in the sad ones, Not in the long one. Not once. Locked the front door, pushed the key through the letterbox, drove away. Got settled in the new place over the next few weeks. Took some adjusting, the quiet. No new rules arriving periodically. No vocabulary test when I responded to something the wrong way. No diagnosis every time I had a normal human reaction. I fixed things when they needed fixing because that's what I do. Nobody commented on it being a problem. Nobody took it for granted either because there was nobody there to take it for granted. Which is its own kind of thing. Not straightforwardly good or bad, just the reality of being on your own after not being on your own. Mostly, the quiet was fine. Sometimes it wasn't. Ran into someone who knew both of us, maybe 6 weeks after. He brought it up, said that Zara had been telling people the relationship had ended because of my emotional unavailability and resistance to growth. I nodded. Said I hoped she was doing all right and meant it genuinely. He looked at me like he was expecting more of a reaction. I didn't have one. Not because I didn't care, more because of course that was the story. Of course it was. Anyway, that's all of it. If there's a point somewhere in there, I'm honestly not sure I'm the right person to spell it out. But something like this, maybe. If you make a rule specifically to stop someone from doing the thing they naturally do for you, and you make that rule without applying any version of it to yourself, and you do it while gradually stopping to notice or appreciate the other things they do, don't be surprised when they stop volunteering things, and really don't be surprised when eventually they stop doing everything else too. Fixing things was how I showed up. Wasn't eloquent, wasn't everything a relationship needs, definitely wasn't perfect. But it was real, and it was consistent, and it was mine. The evening she sat down with her phone and called it a toxic pattern was probably the beginning of the end. I just didn't understand that for a while. Took standing in a hallway looking at a closed bathroom door to actually get it. But that's when it started. I did think about it a lot in the first weeks after. Not in a what could I have done differently way exactly. More just trying to understand the shape of what had happened. At what point does adjusting for someone stop being accommodation and start being erasure? I couldn't tell you exactly. There wasn't a clear line I could point to. It happened gradually, incrementally, one reasonable sounding request at a time. I think the thing that bothered me most wasn't even the rule itself. It was that she'd taken something real, the genuine care behind doing practical things for someone, and told me it was a problem. Reframed the most natural way I had of being useful as evidence of something wrong with me, and I believed her enough to stop doing it. That's the part that took me a while to sit with. Not that she'd had expectations I couldn't meet, but that I'd been convinced to distrust my own instincts, my own ways of showing up, for long enough that I stopped recognizing them as valid. I'm not saying I had it all right. I'm not saying the relationship failed entirely because of her. I'm sure there were things I could have done differently, handled better, paid more attention to. But at some point, I started keeping a mental tally of how many rules I was following and how many times those rules were applied to me versus to her. And when the answer is all of them and zero, consistently, over months, you're not in a partnership anymore. You're just the person who gets to apologize for how they exist. Anyway, that's all. Take from it what you want.